So in today's webinar, we'll be discussing what Mentor Michigan has called the Men in Mentoring or Men and Mentoring. You'll see it a couple different ways. And really the subject matter for today's webinar is what we've titled New Techniques for Recruitment. And before we get into some of the specific content for today's session, I want to kind of give you just a really brief explanation of what Mentor Michigan's involvements have been in statewide recruitments campaign, because I think that context is helpful for all of you before we get into the specific content. So Mentor Michigan has always been focused since its inception on recruiting male volunteers, because we know through the statewide survey that we do called the Mentor Michigan Census that mentoring programs throughout the state consistently report a lack of male volunteers. So one of the greatest needs that mentoring programs have annually, year to year, and this has always been true since the census began several years ago, is male volunteers. So Mentor Michigan has always kind of been focused on improving strategies to recruit volunteers, especially men, and recruitment campaigns statewide and locally. But a few years ago, through a generous grant from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Mentor Michigan was able to engage several specific mentoring programs around the state in what we called the Men in Mentoring campaign. Now, this specific recruitment campaign was designed to give these handful of mentoring programs some dedicated resources to focus on male mentor recruitment and to identify promising strategies for recruiting and retaining male volunteers. So this campaign, the Men in Mentoring campaign, in conjunction with some other partnerships that Mentor Michigan has, as well as a variety of different types of research, has helped us develop what we're really going to focus on today, and that's what we call the Men in Mentoring Toolkit. So this toolkit is actually a freely available resource for mentoring practitioners statewide and nationally, and you can find it on Mentor Michigan's website, mentormichigan.org. And in a nutshell, the Men in Mentoring Toolkit is sort of the culmination of the Men in Mentoring campaign. So it's the culmination of 2 years of grant-funded work by Kellogg around developing strategies and systems to recruit male volunteers. When you're able to download the toolkit and take a look at it yourself perhaps after this webinar, you'll see that it's broken down into several different components and actually comes in a variety of different formats. So there's a bunch of different stuff that the toolkit covers. And today we're going to really kind of narrow our focus on one specific component of this toolkit, and it's the section that we like to talk about as the complete recruitment message. Or kind of in other words, we're going to focus on what we think the core components of messages that seem to be attractive to male volunteers. As I mentioned, the toolkit comes in several formats because we want it to be accessible to a variety of audiences. So for those of you who are visual / kind of reading learners, we have developed some PDF documents which you can go ahead and download and take a read through. And those contain strategies, targeted language, and a variety of talking points and other tips which we'll reference throughout the day. Second, the entire toolkit is in an audio podcast format. So if you're an audio learner, we hired a professional to come in and actually kind of read through this stuff. So if you prefer to hear things rather than read things, or if you like me and you kind of think sometimes things sound better when you say them versus when you read them, you might be interested in those. And then finally, there's a modified version of the presentation that you'll see today. And that presentation is designed in kind of a train-the-trainer format, which means once you've kind of gone through today's session, you could look through the toolkit and utilize this pre-made PowerPoint presentation so that you're able to share this information with other mentoring practitioners, maybe at at your organization, or perhaps with a local mentoring collaborative or other type of youth serving collaborative. So really the idea is that we can provide some training to the mentoring practitioners such as yourselves, and then you're able to kind of replicate that in your local community. So again, to reiterate, our goal for today is really to kind of give you a really basic overview of the toolkit and kind of introduce you to what it is and how it was designed and how it's intended to be used. And then to kind of give some specific training and information about what we think kind of makes up the essential components of successful recruiting practices and strategies as it relates to male volunteers. We certainly can't cover all of the content today in 1 hour, so we're definitely going to narrow our focus that way and hopefully kind of whet your appetite so that you're intrigued and motivated to go ahead and download this toolkit and familiarize yourself with this resource. What you see here on the screen now is just kind of a bullet-by-bullet breakdown of we think these essential components are. We'll spend the bulk of our time focusing in on these and kind of talking through what each of them means and how they can be implemented within mentoring programs and recruitment messaging. And as we're talking through them today, I think it will be helpful to kind of keep in mind that the language that you see and hear, as well as the tips and examples that will come through, are all really intentionally developed and strategically developed. And then kind of the flip side of that coin, so on the one hand we've definitely been strategic and intentional with our language and examples. The flip side of that coin is that we don't intend this toolkit to be a one-size-fits-all approach to recruitment. We understand that every community is different, every culture is different, I mean, every demographic is different. So as a result of that, your program will need to modify and adapt the things that you might hear today that are specific to your target audiences. And we understand that and understand that the success of strategies like this ultimately depends on your creativity and resourcefulness within your local communities. But generally speaking, we think that the things that we'll identify today are critical and important to the success of recruiting male volunteers. Give me 1 second as I pause to correct a setting and glitch with our webinar software. Okay, thanks. So before we get into an in-depth discussion on what those components are, I'll take kind of 1 second to pause to go over a couple kind of general observations that emerged from our work around recruiting male volunteers. And firstly, one thing that's important to remember when you're recruiting volunteers, and this is male and female volunteers, is that fundamentally you're making a sales pitch. You're trying to sell the recruit on mentoring in the first place, and you're trying to sell the recruit on your program in the second place. So it's helpful to keep some kind of general marketing techniques in mind, so kind of sales 101. Now, if you're anything like me, sales isn't your strong suit, so I'm not naturally a good salesman. I tried sales for a while and I just didn't succeed. It wasn't the thing that I was best at. So I've had to work at this. I've had to work at how I talk about mentoring. I've had to develop some really specific language and go-to stories that I'll talk about later in the presentation to help me overcome what really is a weakness for me. And I think we found that this is kind of true broadly in youth serving organizations and really in the human services field as a whole. One thing we're not always good about is selling people on our ideas and our programs. So there's just a couple, without going too in-depth, a couple principles that I think can be helpful that all of us can keep in mind in our recruiting efforts. In the first place, think about sort of the trajectory of your conversations. And what I mean is it may be helpful to kind of start with kind of broad and non-committal language and then gradually move towards personal and persuasive conversation. So if you think about a time maybe where you've had a really bad sales pitch made to you, and I'm thinking of a time really specifically over the holidays. I went to a local electronics store and was pitched with a really bad pitch, and I was totally turned off to the product. But on the flip side, I think all of us have worked with a salesperson with whom we actually felt like we made a good connection, and that person convinced us that the product or service we were interested in was useful and beneficial to us, and maybe it led to a sale, and the salesman was happy because he or she made a sale, and we were happy as the consumer because we got connected with a product or a service we genuinely wanted. And I think in many cases, at least from my perspective as the consumer, I appreciate it when people take that sort of non-persuasive approach to start and really give me a chance to express what I'm looking for and what I'm interested in. Secondly, we found that it's really helpful to help men identify stories and experiences from their own lives that connect with what we mean by mentoring. So we found that it's helpful to really focus in on each individual candidate as an individual with a unique set of experiences. And sometimes this can be even more effective than focusing on broad issues, and we'll talk a second about what we mean by that. But just generally speaking, if you're the type that likes to reference statistics in your recruitment strategies and presentations, maybe you can make those even more effective by connecting statistics with personal examples, either from your experience or your program's experience, and then whenever possible, maybe even examples from the recruit's own life. I think it's helpful to discuss how their unique personal traits and abilities can help result in a positive outcome for a young person. Men want to know that they have what it takes to be a mentor and that they'll succeed in this endeavor. Thirdly, I think it's critical to be conversational, and such an important part of a conversation is listening. Listening is really important for several reasons, and here are just a couple. First, I think there's value in expressing genuine interest in our volunteers. So the people that we engage in as volunteers are important to us in our program, and it's important that we express that by giving them opportunity to communicate with us. Second, when we listen, as I mentioned just a second ago, we can pick up on experiences and skills and stories that can help make us better and more effective recruiters. And a great example would be if a man had a strong male example in his life, maybe a coach or a minister or some other type of figure, appealing to that story and helping connect the idea of mentoring with that personal experience can be a very effective way to convince a man about the importance of mentoring. And then finally, kind of the last Sales 101 thing that we'll talk about is that the personal and direct ask is probably the most critical component. And if there's nothing else that you take away from today, I hope that it would be this. The thing that we've learned in our experience here has been that we can do everything right and then fail to make the ask directly and honestly, and that can be one of the biggest obstacles to getting men enrolled and matched with young people throughout the state. So with those general considerations kind of laying the groundwork, we can kind of launch into the content for today's presentation, which is really these handful of components that contribute to complete recruitment messaging. We'll start with the first one, which we simply call awareness, or making the case for mentoring. So those of us who have spent even a short time in the mentoring field know how great the need for mentors is, and especially the need for male mentors. And as a result of this, it's easy for us to take this for granted as an assumption. So because we are so familiar with this need for male mentors, it's easier for us to assume that everybody knows this because it's so prevalent in our work and in our experiences. But we need to remember that potential recruits aren't likely to share that background knowledge. They may not know how many young men in their community could benefit from a mentor, and they may not know what the benefits of mentoring relationships can be. And there's two sides to that coin. There are benefits to young people, and there are benefits to the volunteer mentors. So the first step in successfully recruiting men is establishing that awareness. What is mentoring? Why it is important? Why is it important, and what does it have to do with me? Over the next couple of slides, we're going to look at a few specific examples of how we can go about doing this. And again, this isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. These are examples of ways that this has been done in mentoring programs throughout the state successfully. You'll see some examples of language and talking points that are specifically designed to help establish this basic level of awareness. And you'll see a couple resources engaged and utilized that are readily available to everyone, and that's statistics and stories. And we'll try to pair those two things together in a way that's effective when it comes to establishing awareness about mentoring. And I'm going to pause real quickly for a couple questions that have come in through the question box real quick. Julia asks this: if you're in a dinner group and there are 5 men you could ask, how do you ask all of them without seeming like you're just there to use them for job purposes? And then kind of a follow-up. The dinner group is a weekly thing and they're becoming good friends. Okay, Julia, that's an excellent question. Ask me again toward the end of the presentation, because we'll kind of talk about a couple things throughout the presentation that might help give you some ideas for how to go about this. But if you don't feel like the question was answered well, make sure you do raise that again toward the end of the presentation. Thanks for your question. So here we're going to actually go ahead and look at a specific example of how this might work in practice. And again, just to make sure that it's understood by everyone, this is how the Men in Mentoring Toolkit is designed to work. It's designed to kind of give you some specific contexts and templates for how you might take these lessons that we learned in our work and apply them to specific situations. So this particular one is just a short paragraph of intentional language that you might use if you were presenting to kind of a large group. So Julia, your question about a group of 5 at dinner, you might use some of this language or you might use some from the next one. But let's just take a brief second to hear how this might sound. So the language is specific and the tone is specific, and so let's just take a second to listen to this. So what you might say if you're presenting to a large group, trying to establish awareness. Statewide, there are more than 3,500 kids waiting to be matched with a mentor. And right here in our program, we have 125 that are waiting for someone like you. You know, that might sound like an enormous problem that you can't solve. But let me tell you how you can make a difference. Kyle is an 8-year-old boy in our program, growing up without a dad or other positive male influence. His mother works 2 jobs and he really could use a mentor in his life. Becoming Kyle's friend puts us another step closer to our goal, and it makes a really big difference for him. Now, a couple things that I kind of want to tease out of this paragraph. If you think about how this paragraph kind of flows from start to finish, you'll see that it starts with kind of broad language without asking for any commitment. It's just painting the picture of a lot of kids who could use an adult throughout the state of Michigan. Then it kind of narrows in to the specific program that's being talked about, and then it narrows in even further by highlighting one key example from the program. And it paints a very clear picture of just a young 8-year-old boy with a single mom working 2 jobs. And finally, it doesn't get to the ask yet. It doesn't ask for a new mentor to volunteer yet because we haven't gotten there. But it starts to make the case for why mentoring is important. Kyle's a young man without an adult male in his life, and he just needs a friend. So that's something you might employ in a large group setting. You can do the same type of thing in an individual setting, but you might kind of phrase your language differently and utilize some statistics differently. So here's an example of how it might sound in an individual setting or maybe with a really small group of people. So you might say something like, right now we are working to connect 125 kids right here in this community. These are kids who really just need someone like you in their lives. We've got a boy named Kyle in our program, and he's been waiting for a year for a mentor. He could really use someone like you just to hang out with him. It's about an hour a week just to be his friend. He would grow so much from spending time with someone like you. So this is sort of a little bit obvious, but just do want to point this out. Did you notice how the kind of the tone and trajectory of the conversation is different? So this is sort of obvious when you're speaking to a large group. You might use different statistics than you would when you're speaking to one person or to a small group of people. But also the tone is different. It's easier to be conversational when you're kind of in a one-on-one setting. And then the last thing I wanted to point out about these is that these stories, when you're able to pair statistics, so talking about 3,000 to 4,000 kids in the state who could need a mentor, pairing that large number with a personal story helps to be a little bit disarming, and it makes the problem feel like there's a realistic solution and then there's an attainable, realistic solution to the problem. I want to point out one more question that's come in. So Rebecca, it's more of a comment. So Rebecca says, I was told not to use numbers weighting because it sounds too intimidating. So Rebecca, that's an excellent point. Each program is going to have different approaches to how you choose to utilize statewide statistics or waiting list statistics versus personal stories, or in some cases maybe leaving out numbers. And Rebecca, since I know your situation, if that's what your organization chooses to do in their recruitment strategies, that's certainly fine. You don't need to use statistics. You don't necessarily have to. The reason we use them in these examples early on, and the reason we sort of connect them with stories, is for that very reason. So if you were to sort of paint the picture of 3,000 kids in the state and not connect that with one young man in your program, I would agree. I think that does sound very intimidating, and I think that sounds like a really big problem that I as an individual can't do much about. And in your organization, it sounds like you've opted to even ignore kind of your waiting list numbers in your recruitment, and that's fine too. You might choose to just utilize very specific examples or very specific stories from your programming, and I would say that's just as effective when it comes to establishing awareness about the need for mentors and mentoring. So I would absolutely agree with that. So in addition to some of these examples that we've created, we've tried to provide some really specific talking points that you can sort of use as a template in your organization to help you get thinking about what it would mean to paint a clear picture about awareness of the need for mentoring. I won't read through all of these that you'll see. I just want to point them out to you. So each of these components, and we're on the first one now, starting with awareness, has examples of language that you can use in various settings, as well as talking points that it's not necessarily a canned speech, but it is language that you can kind of become familiar with and really commit to memory, so that when you're out in the field recruiting, you're well prepared and ready to talk about these things in ways that make sense and ways that are effective. So without kind of just reading the text to you on the screens, you can kind of see that these talking points are really focused around establishing awareness or making the case for mentoring, why it's important, and what it has to do with the potential recruit. And you'll see these for every one of these components throughout the Men in Mentoring Toolkit, from awareness to closing and making the ask. So the second component in the Men in Mentoring Toolkit focuses on developing understanding. So first is establishing awareness, and second is establishing understanding. And I think this is actually a really good segue from Rebecca's comment earlier, and that's how important the role of stories can be in recruiting. So what I mentioned in awareness is that it can be effective to pair and combine statistics with personal examples. And we're really building on that concept when we talk about the role of stories. What we found is that stories really establish the groundwork for empathy and understanding. And we found that it's important to use stories so that men understand how mentors can make a difference. And again, to address Rebecca's comment, this might be precisely why your organization steers away from waiting lists and stats, because stories can be much more effective. Often the most successful stories, as we've mentioned, are the personal stories of potential recruits, which only serves to reiterate the importance of listening and being conversational when we are in recruiting. Obviously, this requires sensitivity, because not every one of our potential male recruits will have had positive male role models in their lives. Sometimes men who come to our mentoring programs come to volunteer because they know what it's like to grow up without a positive male role model. So we need to be sensitive in those situations, that we are very cautious in how we speak with our language. But even in those situations, it still may be possible to use that potential recruit's life experience to help them understand the importance of mentoring. So if a potential mentor had a really positive male role model, it may be possible to draw upon that experience to help the potential mentor understand. And conversely, if a young man grew up without a positive male role model, it may be possible to draw upon that experience to help them understand the importance of mentoring. Now, there are a few things to consider when selecting your story or your stories, and I kind of like to talk about them as your go-to stories. We found that it's important to highlight people from outside the home and non-familial relationships so that it's clearly established what the role of a mentor is and how that is different from the role of a father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. We want to avoid confusion, and we want to avoid confusing terminology that may indicate that more time and commitment is required than is actually expected. Mentors aren't replacement fathers. They're not replacement grandfathers or uncles. Instead, they are friends, and we want to choose language and stories that conveys that message to them accurately. Further, you may also want to consider some specific types of terminology, and the easy example to use is the phrase role model. We found that in some areas in Michigan, depending on the demographics, the word role model was actually more of a turnoff than an effective term. And what we learned was that when some men hear that word, it overstated what the role of a mentor was in their mind. So mentors, as we all know, do become role models over the course of a mentoring relationship. But introducing that term during recruitment can have the negative impact of making mentoring sound much bigger and much harder than it actually is. So do keep in mind the phrases and the taglines and really ask the critical questions, the critical self-assessment questions of whether or not that language oversells or undersells or accurately describes what you're trying to communicate. Also, when you think about stories to use, it may be effective for you to consider stories from your own life, and that's actually the case for me. You may also have success stories in your program that become kind of your go-to stories. You might have young men on your waiting list who become kind of your go-to story. And then, as we've mentioned, whenever it is possible, given the situation, try to identify that go-to story of the candidate. What's the life experience they have that helps them understand mentoring? My story is simply about actually my basketball coach from high school, and I have a variety of different forms of it. I kind of have a short form, a middle form, and a long form that I'm able to utilize depending on the setting. And kind of without going through all of that with you, I will say the things that I try to highlight that story serve to build kind of an accurate picture of what mentoring can be. I make sure that I communicate that it was a consistent effort on his part and on our part. I make sure to communicate that it wasn't an enormous requirement, but it did require some time. The story illustrates the fact that mentors aren't replacement fathers or grandfathers. It's someone who's kind of outside of the familial relationship who serves as a friend and a guide, and in this case a coach. And I kind of emphasize the important role that this man was able to play as I was a young man and growing to become a man. And that story is chosen intentionally for all of those reasons because in my mind it communicates very clearly what mentoring is about, and it's an experience that a lot of men share. A lot of men had coaches or teachers or someone in their life who did some type of similar role for them, and it really helps paint the picture very clearly. And so I would encourage you to find that go-to story for yourself, and I'd encourage you to think about and prepare in advance different versions of it so that you're prepared when you have 30 seconds in an elevator versus 10 minutes to present to a large group. How can you tell that story in a short form, and how can you tell that story in a long form, and kind of everywhere in between? I'm going to pause real quick for a question from Thomas. And Thomas, what demographic didn't like the word role model? So there were really two organizations that raised this flag from our pilot program that we did with 6 throughout the state. That came from a mentoring program in Southeast Michigan, and that feedback came from a program in Lansing, Michigan. And it spurred larger conversations that I think triggered in the minds of people serving throughout the state, that was maybe a word we wanted to be really cautious about and intentional about. And again, just to reiterate, what the word did for these in these programs anyway was really oversell what was being asked of the potential volunteer, and the word role model made mentoring feel too big and too large. And really, as I mentioned, we know that mentors do become role models, and I think mentors do begin to embrace that as their relationships progress. But I think it can sound a little bit intimidating on the front end. And then Thomas asks a follow-up question: what word works best instead of role model? And the word we like to use is simply friend. I think the word guide can be effective. I mean, maybe you wouldn't use it as a noun, but kind of a guiding role or a friendship role. Really, as you'll see as we get into some other parts of today's presentation, you'll see the word friend appear in a variety of contexts. And that's the language we've tended to favor over the word role model, and also over those familial relationships like uncle or grandfather or father. But again, that may vary based on your audience. You'll have to be perceptive and tuned into the feedback that you're getting from the recruits that you're trying to get enrolled in the program. Again, as we saw with awareness, which was the first component, we've tried to provide some examples of how this works in practice and how it's worked effectively in practice. And again, I won't kind of read these through to you for the sake of respecting all of our time and keeping your attention. I obviously don't want to bore you either. But know that there are some examples to help get you thinking about this. And Thomas, I'd encourage you to actually go ahead and download this resource. It's totally and completely free. And as you read through some of these examples, you'll see some of the language we've used and that emerged as a successful practice. And you may find that type of language, or maybe some language we haven't thought of yet, becomes what is effective for you and your community. And then we've also got these talking points. So in addition to trying to spur your creative juices around specific presentation language, we've got just talking points that you can kind of read through and maybe kind of commit to memory, so that even in casual conversation, you have some go-to language that helps trigger understanding about why mentoring is important. Moving on then to the third component, which we call just simply comfort, or in other words, you can do it. Moving then to the third component of recruitment messaging. Getting men comfortable with the idea of mentoring requires addressing any fears that men may have head on. So while they may not say it, most men are going to be at least concerned in some way with the fact that they may or may not have the right skills to be a good mentor. So they might be worried that they lack the skills necessary, or they lack the personality necessary, or maybe they just don't know what to do with a kid for an hour. So whether or not they say it, it's likely that these types of things will be on their mind. So we found that it's helpful to obviously be aware of this, but then also to be prepared to address these things preemptively in your recruitment strategies and in your recruitment messaging. So men need to be assured that they already possess the skills and characteristics that they need to make a difference in the life of a young man. And Thomas, as this gets to your question, mentors are friends, and every guy, every adult has the capacity and the ability to be a friend. So look for ways to emphasize this important point in the stories you use, or in the stories that recruits might share with you from their own lives. Men must also be able to understand the important quality that they bring to the table is themselves. So the most important thing that men bring to the table is their own unique personality, their own unique interests, and their own hobbies, etc. The most important thing they bring is their life experience as a man. In the very beginning of the presentation and throughout, I've mentioned the importance of listening and being conversational as much as you're able to, given the context of your recruitment presentation. And I think this is another place to reiterate it. Use whatever information you have as the result of listening to help show recruits that they already have what it takes to be a successful mentor. So you'll learn personality traits through interviews and intake surveys and so on and so forth. Look for ways to reassure candidates that they can do it and to help get them comfortable with the fact that they can do it. I'm sorry, I just had a little glitch there with my software. Sorry for the pause. Now there are some, again, additional talking points and examples, and there are a couple here that I just want to tease out because they specifically address things that are very commonly raised by potential male volunteers and even existing male volunteers. So how many of you have ever heard someone worry about mentoring because they're worried about it's going to cost money, or it's worried that they're going to have to give lots of gifts? Those types of things can be on the minds of male volunteers because for a lot of our new recruits, mentoring is a new idea. So it's important to be prepared to address those things. So you might have some go-to language that's as simple as, mentoring is about sharing your time. It's not about money, it's not about gifts or events. Mentoring is just about being there for a young person. Or you might say something as simple as, mentoring is often as uncomplicated as engaging in what appears ordinary to us. So helping a kid out with some homework or playing a board game and just talking and listening. That kind of stuff might seem ordinary to you, but to a child without any older guys in their lives, these are really important and sometimes even extraordinary activities. Or you might have something prepared that is something as simple as, the moment you become a mentor to a child, your experience is already a success. For these kids, your willingness just to spend some time with them is the most powerful act of all. So that's obviously really simple language, and maybe it almost feels too simple, but it's also really important language because mentoring for a man who's new to the idea of it can be a little bit scary. So be prepared to have some simple language that paints very clearly what mentoring is about so they are able to get comfortable with the idea. And Thomas asks a question about specific locations to identify male recruits. Thomas, that's something that I'm happy to talk with you about. I'll throw my email address up at the end of this presentation. I'm happy to brainstorm that with you individually because it varies so widely from community to community. And I'd also invite any participants who are listening, if you've had community collaborations or if you've had community partnerships or any type of successful venue for recruiting male volunteers and would like to share that with the rest of the group, feel free to send that out via a chat message or the question box, and I'm happy to share that out with everybody else. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground and we're nearing the end here. We've talked through the importance of making the case for mentoring, why it's important to establish awareness. We've talked about understanding, and as Rebecca noted, stories can be so powerful. We've also talked about the importance of establishing a comfort level with the potential volunteer. And now we're going to talk about the importance of being clear about commitment. Like many of you who are with us on the call today, I'm sure that you've been a volunteer for the majority of your life or have volunteered throughout different portions of your life, and that's certainly my experience. And speaking from the perspective of a volunteer and not from the perspective of a mentoring practitioner right now, I appreciate it as a volunteer when the person who's managing my volunteer service is clear with me. And I think in the same way, all of our volunteer mentors deserve to know up front what we're really expecting of them. We don't want to feel like we're pulling a bait and switch, and we think it's important to address commitment right on the front end. So whether or not you get the question directly from a recruit, know that somewhere, either on the back of their minds or the front of their minds, they're wondering things like, what do you expect of me? How much time is this really going to take? And when does it end? How long am I signing up for here? So it's important to have a really simple response to those questions prepared. Thinking of kind of a traditional one-to-one based, community-based model, we might have something prepared that's as simple as, you know, John, we're asking for 1 hour a week for a year because we know that young men who have this type of relationship are more likely to become successful men themselves. So it's a simple, 2 sentences long bit of language that clearly describes what is being asked for out of the potential volunteer. Providing this type of clarity empowers men to make the right choice for themselves and for their program. Because for a variety of reasons, not every potential guy that you identify as a recruit is necessarily a good fit. Not all men are ready to become mentors. Not all men are able to become mentors due to programmatic requirements, family commitments, employment obligations, and so on. So in some ways, a conversation around commitment can kind of be one of the first steps in your mentor screening process. By talking about commitment clearly on the front end, both of you can be very realistic about whether the potential candidate is able to make the commitment that's required for your program. So it's really important for 2 reasons. On the one hand, it's important to talk about commitment accurately so that mentoring isn't a scary proposition. We're not asking for multiple hours a week. We're asking for a relatively small but important commitment to a young person and to a program. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that we emphasize the importance of that commitment, whatever your programmatic requirements are, so that candidates and you as the recruiter know whether or not there is a real chance for this person to become involved with your program. So on the one hand, we don't want to scare away potential candidates who might be a good fit, but on the other hand, we do want to determine whether or not a prospect is really serious about working with children or not. So in addition to what we just covered briefly there, and we're beginning to kind of pick up the pace as we reach the end of our hour, there are a variety of examples and talking points around commitment to help spur your creative juices around this topic area. But for the sake of time, and because I'm confident that you'll all be able to utilize the toolkit on your own time as well, we'll transition then into the next component, which we just call success, or the ability to win. So once we've painted the picture about why mentoring is important and about why, oh, another glitch in the software. Give me just 1 second to fix that for you all. Okay, thanks for bearing with me there. Okay, so now you should all be seeing what I'm looking at as well, which is the slide about success. So painting the picture all the way from the importance of awareness up through commitment, we kind of arrive at the point where it's important to affirm that mentoring is a winning proposition. So again, while this might not directly be asked of you, it's likely that male candidates will have at least some concerns about the fear of failure. And as a result, men need to know that mentoring is a winning proposition, both for themselves as a volunteer mentor and for the young man that they'll connect with in this relationship. It's important to remember that most men are probably not going to want to talk about this openly, but the concern is surely there. So it's helpful, again, to be prepared ahead of time to address this concern preemptively but also gently. So there's a really simple way that you can do this, and it may involve obviously elaborating and talking more about it. But the tagline that you see at the bottom of the screen is something I use on business cards and other recruitment that we do here at Mentor Michigan, and it's as simple as this: you're the right person, you have the right skills, and you will succeed. So again, kind of thinking back to something I mentioned earlier, one of the most important qualities that every male recruit brings to the table is their own life experience of growing from a young boy through adolescence and then into adulthood. And so every man is equipped with that life experience and able to share that through a friendship with a young man. So when we say you're the right person, you have the right skills, and you will succeed, that's really what we're talking about. you're now an adult, or potentially, some of you recruit college students as well, so you want to change your language appropriately, but you've grown up. You've become a young man, or you've become a successful adult, and you have this life experience, and because you have that, you'll be successful because you as an adult know how to be a friend to a kid. So that's really what we mean when we're talking about success. It's just painting a clear and simple picture that mentoring is a winning proposition. And of course, it's important to emphasize what you see on the screen here, and that's really defining success appropriately within mentoring. So some volunteers, and this is true for men as it is for women, may come to the table with expectations about what the mentoring relationship should produce or generate in the life of a young person. And while we certainly know that mentoring does tend to generate a lot of positive youth outcomes, it's important that we paint a really accurate picture of what success means in mentoring. And so I think it's important to kind of find ways to drive this point home as well. Success isn't necessarily what you accomplish with the young person, because while many young people do experience those types of positive outcomes, those results don't happen overnight, and they take time. And sometimes they're meager, and it takes a long time for them to really manifest themselves. So instead, what we like to talk about is success as being there, as being present. Success in mentoring is when a young person has someone to go to when life throws them a curveball, or someone to go to when there's a chance to celebrate a success. So that's what we mean when we talk about success and the ability to win. And finally, we've kind of come to what we think is kind of the last, and as I mentioned at the beginning, the most important component of all of this work that we've done. We can do an excellent job of establishing awareness and gaining ground in understanding why mentoring is important and getting men comfortable with the idea that they can succeed and so on and so forth. And we can do all of that work and manage to not be successful if we're not really good about making the ask, about closing the deal. Ideally, in a perfect world, we have the time and resources to have one-on-one conversations with each individual recruit. And that's the thing that we want to strive for. But that's not always possible. And this gets to, I believe it was Julia's question about regular dinner conversations that have emerged on a weekly basis. How do I make that ask without cheapening what's becoming a friendship and a relationship? There's no easy answer to those questions, but for now what I would like to emphasize is that we've seen the most success when it comes to recruiting male volunteers when we are able to set up personal, face-to-face conversations with candidates. So we've done the good work of helping them understand mentoring, selling them in the idea, sharing stories with them, and then we take all of that work and we see the payoff when we make the face-to-face ask. There are a variety of different ways you can do this, and it really depends on the readiness of your candidate. On the screen here, you'll see kind of a couple different examples of ways that you might actually make the ask. And Julia, maybe you'll find some of this helpful as you begin to think about how you can have appropriate conversations within the context of the relationships that you're developing, so that those people don't feel like you're using them as simply a means to an end, but that you do really value them. But there are a variety of different ways you might approach the ask. If you found someone who you know is going to be a good fit, you might go with a really strong, kind of almost hard sell, and that's kind of what you see as the first example. John, you seem ready to be a mentor. Would you be willing to come into my office and fill out an application this week? If you discern through the course of conversation that a candidate's ready for that, that would be the way to go. And then kind of moving down the screen, the trajectory of this is from someone who you're really sold on to someone who's maybe not quite as sold on the idea. So if, for example, you've got someone who you think is really interested about mentoring, but you're still sensing some hesitation, you might be prepared with something you see kind of at the bottom of the screen there. And you might say something to our candidate, John, like, John, if you're still unsure about this whole idea of mentoring, you should come to one of our group activities so you can really get a chance to meet one of our mentors and see what mentoring is all about. So when you're prepared to make the ask, it's important to understand the readiness of the candidate and to make an appropriate ask based on their readiness. On the one hand, you definitely don't want to lose a candidate that's ready to join, but on the other hand, you don't want to pressure someone into a decision that they're not ready to make. So you have to be discerning and wise and prepared to make the appropriate ask based on the shape of the conversation you've had. And then finally, and this is kind of our last topic for the day, once you've made the ask, and if you've made the ask before, you'll be familiar with this process, you're going to encounter objections. So what we kind of like to say to folks is, if you keep hearing no, if the answer that you get is no, consistently over and over again, let's think about some reasons why. So what should we do about it? So again, we need to be able to discern someone who is a viable candidate versus someone who isn't a viable candidate, because sometimes a no is a good thing, because some people, while they might make good mentors, aren't in a life situation that would allow them to make commitments. But if you're consistently hearing no, it might be because there are unaddressed concerns in the minds of the candidates that you're talking with. Again, this reiterates and underscores the importance of conversation, so that you can learn what those objectives are and learn how they can be overcome. So let's tackle a really specific example to help frame what I'm talking about here. The last bullet point that you can see on the screen now is just in quotes, "I just don't have enough time." So this is probably the most common objection that you'll hear. So you've done all this work to recruit a man and get him ready to mentor, and you hear, you know, that sounds like a wonderful idea, and you've convinced me that mentoring is important, but I just don't have enough time. So here's a strategy that you might be able to employ to overcome that specific objection. And by sharing this strategy, my hope is that it will help you begin to think about how you can develop a similar strategy for other really common objections that you might hear as it relates to your program. So if you hear someone say, I just don't have enough time, here's one way that you might be able to respond. John, I can certainly understand that. We are all busy people, and I share your concern about the value of time. And I want you to know that I value the time that you've already given to me just by listening to me and hearing me out. But here's something to consider. In order to be a mentor to a kid, you don't have to create an additional hour in your week. We all know there's only 7 days a week and 24 hours in those days. And we don't have to invent or recreate another one in order to be a mentor. Instead, what you can do is think about something that you already do on a consistent basis that you could include a young man in. So here's a couple examples of things I do. I work out at the Y, and it's easy for me to just bring my little brother along once a month just to shoot hoops. It's something I do every month that's just routine for me, but is really special and meaningful to him. Or what we did last month was I had a headlight out in my car, and I had to go to AutoZone, so I just picked him up. We went to AutoZone, and we learned how to install a headlight in a car together, because I'm not a mechanic and I needed to learn too. Or another example you could use is talking about something like a running to Home Depot. So, I had some errands to do around my house. I had a honey-do list. And you know what? Since my little brother doesn't have a male influence in his life, teaching him how to do those normal household things, we just ran to Home Depot, we picked up the supplies, and we did a few odds and ends around the house and then have lunch. So obviously you wouldn't necessarily give all three of those examples at once because you'll bore your candidate to death. But by being prepared for an objection in advance with some really specific examples of ways to overcome that objection, you may find that you're more effective in recruiting male volunteers. I want to pause briefly, as I realize I've neglected to do this up to this point, to unmute any phone lines.
Almost at the end of the webinar.
Getting a little bit of feedback, so I'm going to go ahead and mute a couple lines back up. But if you do have any questions, over the next couple minutes, please take a second to kind of type those in, or feel free to ask them. I've unmuted all of the lines, so if you're on the phone or you have a mic connected to your computer, please don't hesitate to chime in. And then as you're kind of thinking about questions you might have, just a couple concluding thoughts. We kind of moved through, again, specifically the components of recruitment messaging. We moved from awareness all the way to overcoming objections, and we covered a lot of ground in an hour. And I appreciate your participation and your questions and your attentiveness. It's an honor to be able to share these lessons that we've learned through our work with the rest of you. But again, want to reiterate that the resource that we've developed and made available to the field statewide at no cost contains a lot of other stuff that you may find useful. You see on your screen here just a quick breakdown of some really specific talking points that we developed that I didn't even mention today. And you can kind of see a list of how they're broken down. If your program is really focused on recruiting younger men, we developed kind of a one-pager around things to consider, as well as some talking points about how you might try to engage younger men and how you might tell the story of mentoring differently to them as you maybe would older men, which is kind of the next on the list. So if you're focusing in on recruiting seniors and retired males, you might phrase mentoring differently than you would to a young person. We also took some time to put some thought into how women can be successful at recruiting male volunteers, because we do know that in addition to the volunteers that we have being mostly female, we know that within mentoring organizations, the staffing tends to be mostly female as well. And while we have learned that a man recruiting another man tends to be the most successful, there are some things women can do intentionally and strategically to be very effective recruiters of male volunteers as well. And then kind of on down the line, concluding with some tips and tricks for things you might do after the application. And what we mean by that is, once you've identified a candidate and recruited them, what are some steps that you can take to make sure that you don't lose the candidate in the process from application to match? So please do take a look at that at your leisure and when you have some time available, because I think it will be helpful to you. The slide that is loading currently is simply an example of what the toolkit looks like. So when you download the PDF documents, you'll see here kind of a nice looking document that you're able to view on your computer and print as you would have occasion to. One of the things you'll notice throughout, and I didn't mention this just for the sake of time, is that throughout the toolkit, while you will see some pictures like the black and white one here that feature female matches, what we found is that doing things as simple as changing the pictures that you use in your recruiting materials can be helpful. So you'll see throughout the toolkit that we try to feature pictures of young men and male matches because something as simple as that has tended to generate better results. So that's just kind of a visual snapshot for you visual learners out there who might want to see what this looks like. And then lastly, any lingering questions or any lingering comments? I do see one that came in from Thomas. Do you have anything specific as it relates to messaging for recruiting minorities? That's been a commonly asked question and a challenging one because each minority demographic is very different culturally and even geographically. So, for example, I grew up on the west side of the state where there's a large Hispanic population. And in that population, without getting too in-depth, that population on that side of the state tends to heavily value extended familial relationships. So some of the things that programs have done there, they've actually tapped into the importance and value of family outside of kind of the parental relationship, so uncles and cousins and so on and so forth. And they've actually tapped into that shared understanding and shared cultural value to help promote why mentoring is important for the lives of young people and have incorporated some of that into their recruitment practices. Now that's, if you caught, is actually dissimilar from something I said earlier, which was to try to avoid familiar relationships in general because they can oversell what mentoring is. We don't want to say they're replacement fathers and so on. But in that particular community, because of that particular cultural value, that idea has actually been a successful resource when it comes to recruitment. So without knowing the specifics of your community, Thomas, I don't want to get too specific and be misleading. But I think generally what you would want to do is identify, and perhaps this is you, perhaps you are intimately familiar with the culture of that particular demographic in your community. Identify kind of the expert. So maybe it's a male volunteer that you currently have, and talk to that person or brainstorm with others what those key cultural messages are that can be the vehicle for your recruitment messages. So what's the shared value? What's the common shared experience within that cultural demographic that explains mentoring well? And then how do you incorporate that into your messaging? So generally that's the strategy I think that would work the best. And I'm actually happy to connect you with some other people in your community. Obviously depends on where you are, where you might be able to talk about that question more specifically. So please do shoot me an email if that would be helpful to you. I don't see any other questions that have come in, but if you do have questions moving forward over the next couple days or weeks or even months, don't hesitate to shoot me an email or give me a phone call. My contact information is on the screen, and I realize I probably didn't say this as we launched the webinar today, but I'm actually the program director for an AmeriCorps program here in Michigan that's managed by Mentor Michigan, and we're called the Mentor Michigan College Coaching Corps, and we have several AmeriCorps members on the call with us today. And what we do is place AmeriCorps members within youth mentoring organizations to strengthen their capacity to deliver high quality and high quantity mentoring services. So to create new mentoring relationships and to support and strengthen mentoring as a whole statewide. So that's my job here, is to help manage that program. And also I've been involved with the men in mentoring stuff for a few years now. So that's briefly who I am. Don't hesitate to give me a call or an email if you do have any questions. I'm happy to connect you with others or to share resources in any way that's helpful. So thank you all for participating. I hope that it was useful and beneficial to you. And with that said, have a wonderful week and best to all of you in your recruitment efforts as we do the good work of recruiting men to connect with the young men in these important mentoring relationships. So thanks to everyone. Have a great day.